So they're gonna put the fights on an island, like in Enter the Dragon. Okay, cool. I'm certainly not sure that I've seen anything within the realms of sport that I can hold up the events of the last month or so to for comparison. Are we looking at a stroke of genius from the UFC, or a desperate attempt to stay in the headlines as the fights fade out of the realm of possibility? We certainly all have our questions about what exactly the next few months have in store for mixed martial arts, and specifically the UFC. With that in mind, we've compiled a handy guide to everything we know about UFC 249, Fight Island, and the promotion's plan for the year as a whole. The history of UFC 249. Originally scheduled for April 18th with the headlining matchup between Khabib Nurmagomedov and Tony Ferguson for the undisputed lightweight title, the UFC and specifically its president Dana White remained adamant that the ongoing COVID-19 global pandemic would not be enough to shut down their show.
This fight's going to happen. No crowd, whatever it takes. Probably not even going to be in the United States, but this fight's going to happen.
With ideas ranging from a pared-down ringside crew to hosting the event in an empty arena, for a while it did appear as though Dana's push for normalcy would be a successful one, until the powers that be at both ESPN and Disney intervened, forcing the UFC's hand just shy of Fight Week. Following this, Dana admitted to the media that it might be a while until they hear from him again, as he retreated out of the limelight in order to figure out how best to combat this situation. As we all know though, it did not take that long for him to do so, and now, UFC 249 is scheduled to take place on May 9th, this time in Jacksonville, Florida, the home of the next 4 UFC events. So what exactly is happening with Fight Island? Under the ongoing travel restrictions that are in place both in the US and abroad, the notion of getting fighters into a cage together has never been more improbable. And while putting on fights containing US-based athletes is more manageable, only doing so is unrealistic in the long run. This is where Dana's subtle nod to the likes of Enter the Dragon and Mortal Kombat comes into play. His goal, if he can pull it off, is to provide fighters with a location that would serve as a place to stay and train before they ultimately compete in what would be an entirely self-contained operation from the UFC. According to White's recent interview with ESPN's Brett Okamoto, the infrastructure is currently being put in place to allow the promotion to host events on Fight Island and will likely be completed in June. On top of this, the UFC have also taken out 22 new trademarks, half for Fight Island and the other half for UFC Fight Island. At this time, we don't know anything as far as the specifics surrounding Fight Island are concerned, or even where the island itself is. For Dana, keeping things relatively open-ended would likely be a smart move so as not to draw in too much attention in this early stage. Only time will tell exactly how successful this plan will be, but as things stand, the UFC are fully committed to making this incredibly ambitious idea a reality. So what can we expect from UFC 249 in its current form? Well, when you put all of the uncertainty and controversy to one side, what we have here is one of the finest fight cards you'll see all year. Statistically speaking, there is an unusually high number of proven finishers littered from top to bottom, giving some truth to the notion that Dana and his company are looking to ensure maximum levels of violence once the action gets started on May 9th. Power punchers like Francis Ngannou, Jairzinho Rozenstruick, Jeremy Stephens and Vicente Luque, dynamic offensive strikers in Anthony Pettis, Uriah Hall, Niko and Donald Cerrone, nimble submission threats in the form of Oleksei Oleinik, Fabricio Werdum, Jacare Souza, and Bryce Mitchell. And that's before you even mention the headlining contests between Tony Ferguson and Justin Gaethje for the interim-lightweight belt, and Henry Cejudo and Dominick Cruz for the bantamweight strap. It's a card that looks impressive on paper based on name value alone, and perhaps even more impressive when you start digging into the matchups themselves. Simply put, there is an argument to be made that this is the single most violent fight card of this era, an event so stacked with unmissable action fighters that we could well be looking at an instant classic in the making from top to bottom. So what else do we know as things stand? Well, after watching UFC Brasilia, which took place at the very beginning of the Western world's exposure to the COVID-19 crisis, it was very apparent that there was an increased level of tension to be found for the fans, as the sound of each and every punch, kick, elbow and knee resonated that bit louder as a result of the empty arena. And while that card only produced one knockout finish, listening to the lack of live crowd reaction when Gilbert Burns dropped Demian Maia made the entire finishing sequence feel that bit more vicious. I can't say I'm much of a betting man, but I'd be willing to put my house on seeing far more in the way of violent finishes once things get underway at UFC 249. On top of that, everything from the ref's instructions to the coach's mid-fight directions will be crystal clear between the breaks and commentary, leading to a more immersive experience. Now look, I'm not going to say it'll be as good as hearing a roaring crowd, but even still, prepare yourselves for a uniquely interesting watch. Following the cancellation of the original UFC 249 last month, color commentator Joe Rogan explained how he was in many ways grateful that he didn't need to weigh up the pros and cons of fulfilling his duties on the commentary booth that night, stating on an episode of his popular podcast, The Joe Rogan Experience, that he was about 70% sure that he would be calling the fights. In the time since, Dana has come forward to say that Rogan had in fact committed to working on the desk. On top of that, Daniel Cormier also confirmed to Ariel Helwani in a recent chat that he too was preparing to make the trip to join his fellow commentator. As things stand, while no official statement has been given on the matter, we can at least assume that both Rogan and Cormier, if circumstances allow, will be at the very least attempting to be there on the night. Something that will no doubt do wonders in maintaining a classic feel for this show. Dana in a separate interview also made it clear that the veteran ring girl Brittany Palmer would be part of a pared down ringside crew. So is it going to be safe? Are the fighters going to be tested for COVID-19? Okay, so here's where things become unclear. A certain level of respect must be given to the difference between what Dana White is saying and what the UFC are actually doing, because all in all, his stance on the media's criticism of his push for normalcy has been hostile for the most part. When asked by ESPN's Brett Okamoto specifically about fighter testing, his answer was vague at best, telling the reporter that everyone who is with him will get the best medical care available, while stating that the less the media know, the better. We can interpret this as Dana deflecting the question or keeping his cards close to his chest. Either way, it's hard to imagine that measures won't be brought in, given the seriousness of the situation at hand. White's reluctance to spill the beans outright could well be a consequence of his unwillingness to deal with the influx of detailed questions and criticisms that would follow the release of their in-depth coronavirus plan. Which does make sense, but we're still only making assumptions here. In truth, Dana has told us very little, apart from assuring us that the UFC are taking things very seriously. Is that stance completely fair to the fighters and fans? No, I don't think so at all. But for the purposes of this guide, I'm going to leave this section at that and focus on what we do know. So where exactly does the UFC Apex fit into all of this? Well, as things stand, it's becoming increasingly unclear how long the world of sport will continue to be affected by the restrictions that surround public gatherings and events, and through that the closure of gyms and the various other staples that hold this sport together. Built next to the UFC's headquarters in Las Vegas, Nevada, the Apex is a massive, state-of-the-art, multi-million-dollar facility that will serve a similar purpose to Fight Island in the sense that it will allow the UFC to effectively cut out the middleman as they move to produce more shows. Right now, despite the late push for the original UFC 249 to take place there, no shows have been tied to the Apex at the time of this video's writing. But even the most optimistic of predictions do not allow for the possibility of seeing arenas full of people for sporting events anytime soon. This means we're likely going to be looking at a very different landscape as far as all sports are concerned, until all of the fears associated with the COVID-19 pandemic are under control. The UFC are the first major sporting organisation to make moves towards regaining momentum in the middle of this global crisis, and if I had to guess, the Apex will play a greater part in the production of US fight cards before too long. And finally, can they pull it off? Well, I've been trying to keep this video as factual as possible and simply present what information we know or can at the very least assume at this point, without anything in the way of judgment. But if you're asking me personally, I believe that it's safe to say that whatever roadblocks caused the cancellation of UFC 249 originally, through the intervention of Disney and ESPN, have been accounted for here. It would seem odd for the UFC to not only announce one major event so soon after the dramatic failure of their last, but 3 further events to take place in the 2 weeks that follow. As I said before, Dana is playing this one with his cards close to his chest, but given Florida's loosens restrictions on sporting events, I do have every reason to believe that Dana will be successful. What worries me is what might follow. In a time where risk-taking should be minimized wherever possible on a global level, the UFC are certainly playing with fire here. But yes, I believe that we will see the fights go ahead as scheduled, and for now, only time will tell how this frankly insane experiment will play out. If you enjoyed the content, be sure to leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel, and as always, thanks for watching.